For the rest of our morning, we are going to have a conversation with some really incredible people that are doing this work of racial justice, and particularly with a focus of bringing the Black and African American and the Native American Indian voices together. And so our first panelist I want to introduce to you is Brother Anthony Galloway, apparently now the newest nephew to Alona Street Stewart. We'll take him, I guess. We'll take him. He can be one of us. I get jealous of his hair, though. Anthony Galloway holds a BA degree in Ethnic Studies from Metro State University. He's a senior partner at Diindiisi Group, a firm dedicated to cultural change in organizations towards equality. He is also the executive director of the Arts Us Center for the African Diaspora and a founding member of the award-winning Counter Stories radio show and Bearing Witness with Anthony in Georgia. And if you have not listened to those podcasts, do yourself a favor, pull out your smartphones right now, look it up in iTunes or wherever your podcasts come to you, with whatever platform, and subscribe to Counter Stories and Bearing Witness. And in one of the archived episodes of Bearing Witness, you will hear myself and Reverend Pamela Gujiri. I don't want to say it's the best episode of that podcast, but I don't want to say it's not the best episode either. He is currently a, what is that? Licentiate. This sounds bad. He's in his second year on track to complete a Master's of Divinity from United Theological Seminary, and he is also pretty close to being Reverend Anthony Galloway. Am I correct in saying that? So, all right. So, our second panelist is Nevada Littlewolf. She is the Page Amendment Campaign Manager and Executive Director. She is also the co-founder and president of 7 Teachings, an Indigenous and Black-led business that designs new models of policy, practice, systems, change, and solutions. Nevada served as Minnesota's state political director for the 2020 Biden presidential campaign, and she brings years of experience having worked across sectors of politics, community, government, philanthropy, nonprofit, and business. Nevada served on the Virginia City Council for 10 years. Nevada is a citizen of the Leech Lake Nation, and she has 2 children. And she is a trustee and chair of the Women's Foundation of Minnesota and on the governing boards of Clearway, Minnesota. So that is Nevada. And let's see, where is Ebony? There she is. Miss Ebony Adedayo. Good to see you, Ebony. Ebony and I are friends, and this is before I get into her bio. Here's a little personal story, see. Ebony and I grew up in the same denomination. We both left the same denomination for pretty much the same reasons. Ebony and I did our undergraduate studies together. We didn't really know each other then. We did our master's degree studies together and still didn't know each other then. And only after spending like 8 years in the same schools together did we actually kind of, after that, form a working relationship and then a friendship. So I could say I've known Ebony a long time. As I say, I've known Ebony's name a long time. Because honestly, our undergraduate studies, she was one of the only Black people in there. And I'm not lying. So you get a name like Ebony, you're like, one of these things isn't like the others. So I've known her name for a long time, and I've known her still for a number of years as a friend. Ebony Adedayo is the founder of the Aya Collective, a space that centers the expertise and experience of Black women. In this work, she has gathered Black women around writing, education, and training, and spiritual practice. In 2020, Ebony launched the Aya Collective's first online writing cohort, Fragmented and Whole, as well as hosted a summer teach-in series, Talking Black, which featured 4 Black women scholars and thinkers sharing their works as it pertains to identity, politics, culture, and spirituality. In 2021, Ebony hosted the Aya Collective's Black Women Writing Series, featuring 6 Black women authors with recently published work. Ebony works for the City of Minneapolis's Division of Race and Equity as a program manager for resiliency in communities after stress and trauma, and that is titled Recast. In addition to curriculum and program development for Recast, Ebony has also managed the city's work around truth and reconciliation. Ebony is also a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota in curriculum and instruction with minors in culture and teaching and African American and African studies. She holds a Master of Arts in Global and Contextual Studies and a Bachelor of Arts in Pastoral Studies. And she was a licensed minister for a while, and yeah, that's all part of that denomination that both her and I left. She is an incredible public speaker, incredible author. I love her book, The Gospel According to a Black Woman. And the Incomplete Stories is your most recent publication. So definitely look those up, definitely worth the purchase. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists to your respective thrones here. And like they're all seated here, so those of you over here, you may want to, otherwise you're just going to look at me. And not that I'm not fabulous to look at, but so the first welcome, all of you. Did we give them a hand? I don't think we gave them a hand. Let's give them a hand. So, I know that some of you were present. I know, Anthony, you were here present for last night and this morning as well. Thanks. But I want to open this up to any of those who were present for both of our keynotes. What that you heard, either from Christine or Dr. Williams this morning, what kind of struck you? Was there a moment in anything that was shared where you said, I'm going to have to revisit that, I'm going to have to think about that some more? And I'll open that up to whoever wants to.
I'll start. One of the things that that comes to mind as part of the finally telling the truth, which I love how Reverend Dwayne Davis, the pastor here, called out the finally telling the truth piece of that. But how deep that truth goes. Christine last night talked about 1,000 years of oral tradition keeping the lineage, right? That folks could go back thousands of years, and then you get this interruption of, you get this interruption here. And then I started to piece together the years, and then she talks about, would proceed to then talk about, after that interruption with the boarding schools comes in there, 5 generations interrupted when we shifted from, or while we were transitioning in the boarding school tradition to moving to the adoptive. And then I started to see some connective pieces, right? How we moved from chattel slavery to black codes and incarceration and vagrancy laws and things like that try to recreate the workforce through prisons, right? And so it's not just this moment, we know this intellectually, but there was a connective piece in here to zoom out and kind of see a timeline, right? We're in a space where Dakota is speaking on this land 10,000 years before white settlers are here. Thousands of years of lineage and oral tradition interrupted as we tried to remove and kill the culture. And then 5 years of keeping folks out of the home, so there's no ability to repay or reconnect the vestiges of that. And then we end up in the space. And so that, you see the statistics or the numbers or the plots along the experience, but putting it all together in that way, it just hit me like a ton of bricks yesterday. So that was one of the things that just really stood out.
Thank you.
I wasn't here last night. I was in Ely earlier this week and then Duluth, and got back to Minneapolis last night and figured I should get some rest and be ready for today. But I think that I was talking on the break with a person about how we don't have to be everywhere all the time to be doing good work. And I think that's important for us to understand, is that where we do the work is important. And so yesterday, I know that there was also a march for the children who were murdered in the boarding schools. And even though many of us weren't there were so many people who showed up for that. And the rising generation that we have to kind of carry forward the future around these things. We have this historical trauma and the trauma from the past, but how are we healing? How are we moving forward? And how are we taking action today? And I really appreciate the historian, because I'm not a historian, but the information that was shared and weaving together those stories to understand how we are so connected, it's important, because I think of, I think I've been doing this work since birth and didn't know it, because, right, as Indigenous people, as American Indian people, we are the most legislated people in the country because we fall under so many jurisdictions. And so whether I want to be a political person or not, it's not actually my choice. I have to be a political person. And so I have spent my entire life doing the work that I do. And so the history is important, but the kind of work that I do is really in the moment, in terms of what are we doing now and how do we act and behave today so that our future generations are in a good place. And also understanding just the concept of 7 generations, that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. We're in the moment now, but we're also working for future generations. And so I'm really happy to be here this morning and talking with you all and connecting those things.
Yes, so I was online last night listening into Christine's talk and was really happy to see her. I've also known her because of that same denomination. So, stifling that. So I was online listening, and one of the things that I appreciated the whole presentation. Ooh, okay. One of the things that really stood out to me is she talked about how there was this truth and reconciliation process in Canada several years ago. And even with the truth and reconciliation process and the things that came out of that process, and the government knowing about the boarding schools and knowing where the bodies laid, that they still weren't willing to do anything about it until the community actually did something. And that really, I'm like, so what's the point of a truth and reconciliation process if you're not gonna actually do something with what the people said? And that it was only, so now we're seeing these things, and Native bodies have known this, and Black bodies and other people who've been paying attention know that there are bodies, and there are probably lots of bodies in the United States as well, so it's not just Canada's problem, it's our problem here locally as well. But then I was connecting that to what Dr. Williams talked about this morning, and talking about how, you know, we keep talking about these things, and it's not enough to talk. It's not enough to have dialogue. It's not enough to come together and have a feel-good moment where we shed some tears and we cry and we lament if we're still not going to do something about it. So shame on us if after today, after this process of knowing where the bodies, the physical and the metaphorical bodies lay, that we still do nothing about it. Like, shame on us. We might as well go home right now and shut this down and forget this. Like, if we're just going to have a talk to feel good and feel like, oh, we did something, if we don't take care of the bodies.
So, Nevada, you are part of this business that I think is very unique, the seven teachings, which centers indigenous wisdom and Black wisdom. And I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about this business and its purpose.
Absolutely. So my business partner couldn't be here today. His name is Brett Grant, and he is the policy director at Voices for Racial Justice. Brett and I really started working together a few years back on reparations bill here in Minnesota. We were working with Representative Karen Clark, she had just retired, and Representative Susan Allen, who had also just retired. They carried the reparations bill in Minnesota. And so Karen was still working on sort of passing the torch to the next legislator that would carry that legislation. And we had this people's hearing at the Capitol, and it was a hearing like I had never experienced doing work in the political realm my entire life. We had really designed the people's hearing to be that the people would sit at the table, at the conference table, and the people would testify, and the legislators had to sit in the audience and listen. And it was incredibly powerful. We were there, I mean, all day, so there wasn't necessarily this confinement of like, okay, we have 20 minutes for hearing and then it's over. We actually had several hours of time to share stories from all perspectives around Black, African American, and Indigenous, Anishinaabe, Dakota perspectives in Minnesota, and others, right? And I think I actually left that hearing, my head was just like, it just felt like it was on fire or something, because I had heard so many stories from our communities around the need for reparations in Minnesota. And the way that our reparations bill is designed was really around making sure that Black and Indigenous people were coming together around reparations, understanding that the needs and the histories of Black communities are different than the needs and histories of American Indian Indigenous communities, and yet there were so many things that were connected. And so, you know, we continue to do work in community with our communities and inviting other communities of color in. And I think that it was hard because there were times where we'd have folks join in the conversation, and I remember a meeting where we had a group of young Black men who came into the meeting. They were interested in reparations, but they said, no, we're not going to work with the Native community because we're just not. Like, if I want to learn anything about Native people, I can just look it up online, and I don't see reparations for Native people being the same thing as you know, what we need in our communities. And so that was pretty crystal clear that we definitely have a lot of healing work to do within our communities and understanding through our communities. And Brett and I then, you know, went on to form our company, Seven Teachings, and it's based on the Anishinaabe Seven Teachings and the Nguzo Saba Seven Principles. And so we together have made a commitment that we are doing this work together to make sure that we're building solidarity. And we know that we're going to run into people, both in the Native community and the Black community, that may not see that vision, but we actually take those as learnings as well to really try to work through and figure out how we're going to continue to move that forward.
And just as a little story, in one of our meetings with you and Brett, you all were recalling a meeting that you both were at with some of these policymakers and legislators. And one particular white legislator was kind of, I don't know, acting a little bit ridiculous. And I can't remember if it was you or Brett, but they couldn't recall his name at the time, and I named him. And
You immediately knew.
I immediately knew. I named him, and it was exactly who it was. And so that's just a word for all of you white senators and representatives that step out of line. We know who you are, and we talk about you.
I mean, and he was in the audience, but he was trying to take over the meeting. He stood up and he said, we're not talking about this because genocide doesn't exist, and it never existed, and we're not talking about this. And we had a Native elder stand up and tell him, I mean, and I'm not kidding, to sit down and shut up or get out. And he yes, clap. It was like, it was powerful. And so he looked around the room like he was looking for who had his back, but it was all people from community, and everybody just was like, listen to the elder, like sit down and be quiet or leave. And he sat down, he didn't say anything else, and then, you know, people started talking again, and he did sort of creep out of the room and he left. But it was, yeah, and Jim Bear knows exactly who that was.
He came to one of my meetings one time and was summarily told to sit down and shut up as well. Ebony, I know that I'm familiar with your work with the City of Minneapolis and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that went through the City Council process this year. And this commission, similarly to what we're doing at the Minnesota Council of Churches, focuses on the American Indian community and the Black community. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that work, because in full disclosure, both Curtis and myself were part of the working group that helped to advise this process. And there were some challenges.
Just a little.
Just a little. And so I'm wondering if you could just describe some of that work, and this is a space to be open, and if you want to talk about any of those challenges or frustrations.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I certainly will. Thank you for that permission. Yeah, so about a year ago, actually, Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins came to our office. I work within the Division of Race and Equity within the City of Minneapolis. I am the Recast Program Manager. Our grant is done on Thursday, and I am sad and elated at the same time. After 5 years of working on this grant, it's done, and I'm like, God, I don't know what to do with that. I'm having all sorts of emotions. That aside, I also work within the Division of Race and Equity, and once CVP came to us, we call her CVP for short, because that's a long title. She came to us and wanted to start doing this reconciliation process within community and city because of what had happened with George Floyd and the resulting uprising over the summer and what continues to happen in our community. So one thing I will say, the impetus of Recast was the shooting and the murder of Jamar Clark in 2015. And SAMHSA from the federal level looked around the cities in the United States and saw that our communities needed help, needed assistance, because these things, this phenomenon kept occurring. And so Recast, the point of it was to address stress and trauma in community as a result of these structural harms and violences. And I kid you not, every single year that we have had Recast, there has been an officer-involved shooting or murder, or someone has gotten acquitted for what they did. And so, like Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Thurman Blevins, George Floyd, there have been like, if it's not Minneapolis specifically, it's like around Minneapolis. Like every single year we have dealt with that, meaning that every single year in the Twin Cities, over the last 5 or 6 years, a Black man or woman or Native man or woman or child or Latino man or woman has gotten killed by the police. And you wonder why we are the way we are, right? Like if you just look at that, like we are feeling that within the city, but our community over the last 5 or 6 years, at least, when we could keep going back and understand that it's been longer. than 5 or 6 years. And so CVP wants to do this reconciliation process, bringing together city staff and community members to explore what would it mean for us to put together a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to get to the bottom of these injustices, understanding that it's not just the police murder, it is also the housing, and it's the unemployment, and it's the Dakota War where 38 people are killed, and it's, you know, redlining, and it's Rondo, and it's North Minneapolis, and it's all of these different things that have happened in Minneapolis over the last several centuries that has led us to this point. And so our office, when we were a lot larger then, there's only 2 of us right now. I don't have a boss, so it's kind of weird. At that time, we put together kind of a proposal to the city council about how we needed to move this forward. That was approved, and we had the permission of the city council to begin to put together a working group, again, to explore what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would look like. And so I started making phone calls and started inviting people, and I'm like, Jim Bear's got to be on the council, and Dr. DeYoung has got to be on the council, and there are other people that has to be on this working group to help us put together and to think about what this would look like. And so primarily Indigenous and African American bodies are putting together this working group for us to really begin to imagine what a reconciliation process would look like. And one of the things that Christine talked about last night is one of the things we wrestled with early on, because Christine was also on the council. All my friends were on the council. One of the things that we wrestled with early on is like what reconciliation means. And is it too light of a term to really describe holding the city and holding other institutions accountable for the harms that have occurred. And so there is biblical precedence to the word reconciliation, but we know that in faith-based spaces that word gets watered down to really mean, how do we appease whiteness? How do we make white people feel comfortable about the things that they have done to Black and Indigenous bodies? And so I feel like that took up so much space in our time together. It's like, it's not about appeasing whiteness. It's not about making white people feel good. It's not about having these, revealing conversations where white people get off the hook, because that's what happened in South Africa, right? Is that people would come together and white people get to tell their story in these really cathartic ways, but who's being held accountable? Who's giving back land? Who's giving back resources? Like, that did not happen. And when we look across the world in terms of the truth and reconciliation processes that have happened, those things have not taken place. And so I feel like a big piece of the work is like, how do we actually hold the city of Minneapolis's foot to the fire? That we're not gonna just come in here and talk. We're not just gonna have a feel-good session. We're actually gonna do something about that. And so because of the harm that has happened over the last 5 or 6 years, and the verbiage that the city of Minneapolis uses, the council, the electeds, the department chairs, even city staff, we know that we're not in a position to actually trust. And so I feel like a big piece of it was like, how can we, the city that has, the institution that has caused the harm, how do we actually trust it to actually do repair, to be an agent of healing, to be an agent of change? And I think we all, like, even and that's why there's only 2 of us left in our division, and one of us on our way out too. I'm not going to say who their name is, but you're looking right at her. From my lips to God's ears, I promise. But like, the thing is, like, that harm continues to happen. And so how can we trust? How can we hope in something that, continues to fail us? Are we gaslighting ourselves every single time we step into the room and have these conversations, knowing that the trajectory, because of all of the other years, all of the evidence shows us that these institutions, systems don't change. They just don't. You're welcome.
Anthony. So, a number of years ago, and I don't know how many years ago, I heard you before I ever met you through the podcast Counter Stories. And I found it, and the tagline of Counter Stories is a podcast by people of color, for people of color, and everybody else. and you include, and everybody else. And so I subscribed to the podcast and I was going to listen. I'm like, okay, by people of color, for people of color. I like that. And I was, before I even heard the podcast, I was wondering to myself, I bet you they don't got any natives in this podcast. And to my amazement and surprise and pleasure, you do include indigenous perspective. And I'm curious how that group of hosts, how that group of people came together. And because I know that in spaces like this, particularly with indigenous people, speaking just from my own experience, you know, here in the state of Minnesota, we're somewhere around 3% of the state population. And so we can be easily overlooked, even by well-intentioned people of color. So I'm just curious how this group came together, and what drives you in this work? Because you all have been on the air through some pretty incredibly difficult times.
So not everybody on the podcast shares my faith belief, but I think we all, from our various perspectives, share a belief in a universal pull or push on that, and then we can debate about what that is, and we all have a different name for it. But we all were starting to orbit NPR's newsroom or Minnesota Public Radio's newsroom at that time, and there were a few folks in there. One who has since passed away. But she was the director of, Tony Randolph was the director of New Audiences. Chris Roberts was producing, longtime NPR producer, been around forever and a day. The news director at the time, whose name I forget, David Caceres, who used to write for the Miami Herald. Like, there was this nexus in the newsroom, and they were starting to have a conversation about how can we do something different or create a different space in here, because they're implicated as this lily white newsroom, right? And so they wanted to do something different. So at that same time, I came into the Art Town because I was working with the Arts Center for a while, and so I had a conversation with Chris Roberts, did 5 minutes of a tape for Art Hounds, and then all of a sudden we got into this. I'm loquacious, so we stayed in that room until somebody knocked on the door and said, we need this studio for something else. And so we had a great conversation. Meanwhile, Don Eubanks was having a similar conversation with Kate Moose, who was bringing folks in. Luz Maria Frias, who at the time wasn't our Deputy Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, was having conversation. So this orbit started to happen around, and so they were just like, well, let's bring us together. And I kid you not, we get into a room and we're waiting to get taken up, and we all kind of know why we're there, but we know we're just there to kind of just talk about people of color and our presence in the newsroom. And we kind of made an unofficial commitment, because all of us happened to be in the space where all of, Hui Lee, Hmong journalist was there, Don Eubanks, Luz Maria Frias, and we, in the moment of the start, all without talking to each other necessarily, but our spirits lined up and basically said, we're not going to do the thing that we do so many other places, and that is have our entire conversation be dictated by the worry of the response or the feelings of the white folks in the room. And as we began to talk and just open up, we just let them in, because we were basically sure that we were not going to be invited back to have this conversation again. So we might as well just say what we're going to say. And so we eviscerated not just, you know, the newsroom as we experienced it for NPR, but we're bringing up the fact that who gets to ask the questions. A lot of times we hear folks interviewing folks and they're asking questions that people from that community wouldn't. They would ask a whole different set of questions, right? Don is loaded for bear, and he first thing out of his mouth was, I bet nobody around this table can name the 7 reservations in Minnesota. I'll wait. And literally waited. So we had this conversation, and we thought, all right, we did our thing and we're not going to be invited back. And then they invited us back, and they said, so we were having kind of a loose idea about a space or a show or something like that, but that conversation was going so good, we just want to record that. And so we were like, okay. And so we recorded the first one and we did it again. And in that conversation, they were like, well, what would we call this? And so this organic thing started to come forward, but we had some must-haves, right? We have to dictate the conversation, the topic, and the questions asked. NPR must provide somebody from NPR, so they can't just back out and point and say, well, that's something that they're doing over there. You know, the conversations and the things said here are not was that disclaimer that you always see, and not the views of the leadership of, you know, whatever stuff like that. So they couldn't do that. And then the other piece is we wanted to name it. We wanted to be in the control of that. And we devised the name Counter Stories. It's a tenet of critical race theory. It's funny how we're having this debate about critical race theory when this has been around forever and a day, and many of the things that folks use themselves came from that same theory of thought. And so as we began, we thought that there was just going to be this space and we would be in control of it, and we would have this conversation by people of color, for people of color, and we're still on NPR, so we had to add the everywhere else. We wanted to stop at by people of color, for people of color. Right? That doesn't mean that we're not going to have conversations inclusive of white identities and white bodies. It just means that this is the center, this is the focus, right? Within just a short while of recording those podcasts and getting that underway, we have what happened in Ferguson. And then we realized that we can't get too far out before we have unarmed extrajudicial killings happening. And so it became a place for us to deal with our own stuff around that. And it wasn't until we get to our series of missing and murdered women that we really started to get pushback and tension. We actually had somebody recommend, you know, they said, hey, can you do something lighter? What about music or something like that? And that was the thing that made us go, you know what? This isn't going to work inside this box. Even though we're seeing things change around, they hired a black news director. They tried all these different things, but they weren't really hearing us about the needs. It wasn't marketed. I mean, you would hear promos for the biking podcast before you would ever hear a promo for Counter Stories in there. And so we made an offer. We said, hey, why don't we take this independent? We'll do all the content and we'll just work out an agreement for sharing the comment in the air. And then you don't have to worry about any of the institutional things that you can't help, because we're going to do it on our own. And they respectfully thanked us and said, good luck. Do your thing. You know, we'll hand over all the, you know, podcasts and the names and copyrights and all that stuff. And so now in this independent space, the difference that happens in there, we're still at the table talking about the same things, but now we're bringing folks in and having conversations that are untethered and are not for the purpose of white understanding. That, I think, is the big thing that's the driving force to your question all the way through, is that the power and the strength and the healing that happens when you don't have to speak with a constant thought in your mind about how white folks are going to respond to this, tack it, all these types of things. And the comment section is very much policed on our social media because of what folks will say. And so that is kind of the driving force in all of that.
Yeah, I know that space, even though I only joined through listening, is a space of, it feels like it is a space for me. And likewise, it is a way to engage communities of color that are not my own. So when we witness the rise of anti-Asian violence in our country, and then I heard how that impacted Hali, I had developed a relationship with Hali through the sharing of stories through the podcast, and it was a way to bring that moment home in a very real, significant way. And so, shameless plug for the Counter Stories podcast. Subscribe now.
Well, and I want to underscore this, right? The white gaze that is on all of the discussion that is there. Again, it's not designed, and that's why we kept in, even in now, by people of color, for people of color, and everyone else, because we still want everybody at the table for this, but the understanding that there are going to be things that we can do now that aren't about you, but need to include you. Is so important. And so if any of the takeaway comes away from that, I really want to stress that important piece. The amount of energy and stress that it takes away, that is extractive when you have to consistently worry about how what you're going to say is going to be received, viewed, attacked, warped, So when you were talking about the legislator that was causing all the ruckus, you just say, sit shit down and shut up. In my body, I felt this rising thing come up because he's going to leave that and go to a set of talking points that's going to use that very exchange to try to bolster this idea that somehow the important work that's happening there is antithetical to white experience and psyche, right? And that can't be a healing thing for that. And so even in that story, in this safe space with folks who we got each other's back up here, that thing is still rising.
Nevada, Anthony talks about this space separate from the white gaze. And I know that in conversations with you and your business partner, Brett, you have talked about feeling this need for a healing space for people of color, but even more specifically for Black and Indigenous people of color as a healing space separate from, as we've heard, the white gaze. And I'm just wondering if you could just describe what that looks like and when such a space exists, what is the net benefit? What is the healing that can take place in those spaces?
Yeah, well, so we have been a part of sort of facilitating conversations with different organizations where it is BIPOC only space, and it's totally different, right? Because we don't have the white gaze on us because it's a private group, and we have the ability to talk through issues. Particularly, we've been doing this around farming and food sovereignty in Minnesota, and so I think when we hear about what BIPOC farmers are dealing with in terms of access to banking, access to capital, even the transition of land from like a white farmer to a Black or Indigenous farmer. These are things that like when we talk to and like with others, there's always sort of the defensiveness or excuses around like why those things are happening versus just allowing us to actually speak our own truth and what we've experienced and the things that we actually vision for the future and want to do, which is culturally often very different. It's grounded in very different values or different ways of thinking than the dominant culture. And so when we create space in our company for these kinds of conversations, we see true transformation start happening with people and with communities. Also a part of a BIPOC farmers collective that's actually across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the region. And we're very clear, the leadership of this is very clear that there are not white folks coming into that space, even though we get asked all the time that there are white folks who are like, I want to know what you're doing and I want to be there with you. And it's interesting to find that like how that is received when we tell them, no, you can't be in this space with us because it's not for you. And we need to have that healing space for ourselves in that space to actually grow and develop. And I think that there are other ways, where you bring like the podcast or some of the work that I'm doing with like the Page Amendment, where we have voices centered that are from our communities, right? Like with the Page Amendment, it's, we know the disparities in Minnesota in public education are with Black, Indigenous, and students of color, as well as low-income white students. And so there are ways where there has to be solidarity and working, but there also has to be spaces where you have just safe space for BIPOC people. And so it's kind of understanding and being able to like navigate through those things, but that's what we're really, I think that we're exhausted, frankly, and I think we often talk about this quote about how much time will it take? It's taken my mother's time, my father's time, my brothers and sisters' time, but how much time do you need from us for your progress? And so that's where for us, we're like, we need to really get into it. We need to have, we need to just be creating that. We need to be creating that.
Miss Ebony, as I mentioned, you and I grew up in the same denomination. And it is a denomination that I know as an Indigenous person, there was no space for my voice in that denomination. And I think I can say I know that for you as a Black woman, there was just no space for your voice in that. And so it's been one of the joys of our relationship to watch you progress as a writer and move into forming things like the Aya Collective, which is a space for Black women to come together and create. And so even in your book, The Gospel According to a Black Woman, I'm reading that and reading it from someone who knows you personally, I really felt like this solidarity in your liberation, stepping in to a voice that for most of your upbringing has been stifled. And I'm wondering if you could just share, you know, it seems like we are all part of spaces and recognizing spaces that we need that are uniquely our own, separate from the white gaze. And I'm wondering if you could describe the Aya Collective and how, I would just love to hear how, you know, this work empowers other Black women.
Sure. And so one of the reasons I was actually late this morning was because we were having a writing session for the Aya Collective. It's a space that is so sacred to me that I prioritize because it feeds me, and I see that it feeds other Black women as well. I created, and I was actually doing some journaling about this morning during our time writing, trying to go back, and we're putting together an anthology right now called And Let the Black Women Say Ashe. And so I'm super, super excited about it. So I was writing the introduction. I was going back to think about like how we got here, because it's been a long time coming. It's for years I've been dreaming about a space for Black and brown people to come together, and it got refined as the years went on to be just for Black women. And the reason why I just decided to center Black women is because so often I found that people were, even though people were still uncomfortable with BIPOC bodies being separate from white bodies, people are really uncomfortable with Black bodies and Black women doing our thing by ourselves, you know, and not being influenced or impinged on other people. So even when I first started this space, and it used to be called the Kinky Curly Theological Collective, I had other people say, well, why can't it be women of color? Well, what's the space for us? And I'm like, I don't know what your space is. Go create your own space. This space is for me and for people who look like me, not because I hate you and not because I don't want to be in relationship with you, but sometimes I find that Black women's voices and spaces, because of the way anti-Blackness works and the way because of misogynoir works, we don't get taken seriously. And so like I wanted a space where I wouldn't have to do that dance, where I wouldn't have to fight for recognition, where I could just be like, these are my sisters here and they get it and they understand it, and I'm reflecting my experience to them and they're reflecting back to me. And we don't all have the same faith experiences, as you said. We all believe in this higher power, but the way we might relate to that higher power might be a little bit different, but we're bringing our full selves into this space so that we can heal together. And it's been just a really cathartic experience for me since I started it in 2017. So we've hosted dozens of writing workshops. Like I said, we're putting together an anthology right now because we are really focused on writing our stories. And initially when we first came together, I was thinking like, this is gonna be Black Christian women, and we're gonna talk about theology, we're gonna talk about womanism, we're gonna talk about liberation theology. And quickly I realized that I needed to create a bigger container so that all Black women, regardless of how we showed up in our faith expression, no matter how we showed up in our world with the gender and sexual expression, felt that they could be safe. Because so often there are barriers for Black women out in institutions, be it the church, academy, government, you name the institution, Black women are marginalized. They say, you can't come in because you're not Christian. You can't come in because you're not Presbyterian. You can't come in because you don't dress right. You're not queer. You're not straight. You're not all of these different things. And I didn't want to do that. I was like, we're going to be here. We're going to be here together, and we're going to work out all of our differences. The only thing that we have in common is our skin color and our history and the fact that we might be anatomically female. But everything else, we're just gonna work out and we're gonna be here and it's gonna be fine. And it's just been such a cathartic experience to say that we're going to center Black women today. And so I did that this morning. And it was so beautiful. So we had, for 90 minutes, there was about 8 of us on the call, writing and being in community with each other. And before COVID, we were doing it in person. But one of the things that COVID has allowed is for us to reach Black women who are not in Minnesota. So that has been really, really fun.
Is there a way that those of us who are not Black women can support this work?
Yep, buy my books and give us money. So my books you can find at Aya Media Publishing LLC.com, Aya, A-Y-A, Media Publishing LLC.com. You can also, and the right now, a lot of the funding is just going back into my business so that we can continue to produce other stories. I'm actually not drawing an income from it right now. Eventually I will, but at this stage, I'm really pouring the resources back into the Aya Collective. You can also go to ayacollectivemn.com and you can give a personal gift to the Aya Collective to continue to support that work. That's a really great question. Thank you.
Nevada, same question. How can others support your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're doing right now, I mean, so Brett has a full-time job at Voices for Racial Justice. I am doing full-time work with the Page Amendment. But in terms of 7 teachings, I think that if there's an interest in having us come in and do work with your community, I mean, you can reach out to us and we can talk through what that could look like. But additionally, I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Page Amendment, which is work I'm doing currently around public policy. And so I served on the Virginia City Council in northern Minnesota for 10 years. Prior to that, I worked in the court system for about 10 years in child protection work. And I just feel like I've been doing this like engagement work, like I said, my entire life. And always like kind of thinking about how do you get upstream from problems, right? And I think, you know, what I've been talking with some folks recently about is like what's the highest upstream thing, might be culture, but in the political world, it's like really policy and leadership. And so in Minnesota, we have our education provision in the state constitution that was written in 1857. And this was a time in our country when slavery was still legal in parts of our country. We also had the treaties of 1854 and 1855 that were being signed here in Minnesota right before this provision was written, which were largely land grabs against Indigenous people and taking our rights away from us through treaty. And I think, so when we think about that framework around education being established in 1857, we've never in the history of the state of Minnesota ever even attempted to make an amendment to this education provision until now. We have to understand how that policy frames out the reality of people. And I think when I was doing that work when I was younger, just starting out in my professional career in child protection and working for children who had been abused and neglected, and then they were going into systems, right? Systems of foster care, systems of the court system, the public education system, even like, I mean, leading into detention facility or group homes or other things, like this sort of cycle of trauma that continues to like exist. But how do we actually start thinking about dealing with that more systemically? And it wasn't happening in the courtroom, right? Like it needed to go higher into like, where are these policies starting to begin with? What are we working with in our framework? And so, you know, as we're pulling babies out of the river, like where are those babies getting into the river in the first place? So this work for me, the Page Amendment, feels really powerful because it's our Constitution. We have the ability to change the framework around the way that we think about education. And I mean, Minnesota loves to brag about how we're so great. Like we just love to say how we're like the best in the nation on all these things, like our economy and you know, all of these things, right? But the truth is, like, we also are best in the nation around racial disparities and economic disparities. And so you want to start bragging about what you're best at, maybe you should start talking about this in a way that you can work towards solutions to it. And so that we aren't at the top of the list around this anymore, and that we can actually say all children in Minnesota receive a high quality education, all children, not just some. And I think we are really doing this work. I mean, it's like I said earlier, we're centering those people who are most disproportionately impacted by the disparity in this policy work. So we have, I mean, you see the research come from the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, who is led by an Indian American, Neil Kashkari. You see the writer of the language, who's my, my partner that I love working with, Justice Alan Page, who, was a Minnesota Viking. He was the first African American justice on our Supreme Court in Minnesota. He and his wife founded the Page Foundation for Education, and he's been doing education work his entire life. Even when he was a football player, he was doing that important education work. I'm the campaign director and executive director on the campaign side as an Anishinaabe woman. I just hired a deputy who's a woman out in rural Minnesota, who's helping us do rural engagement, because we do know, again, that economically disadvantaged white families are also impacted. And so we want to make sure that we're making those connections, that this is about solidarity in the state around education equity. And it isn't, BIPOC people versus white people, which some people have tried to frame that out to say, oh, it's just a race issue that you're talking about when you talk about education equity. It's not. It impacts all 87 counties in the state of Minnesota are impacted by educational disparities. And really, what that language from 1857 says is that the legislature must, by taxation or otherwise, which is kind of the funding language, provide a uniform system of public education, a uniform system of public education that is adequate. And that's been defined by law, that the only thing we need to do in public education is have an adequate level. So we're flipping it on its head. We're talking about quality education. We're talking about centering children at that. And we're also talking about holding the system accountable. And this is the language we're proposing, and we continue to talk with community and make sure those community voices are centered, and that we have Representative Hadan Hassan in the House, who's our chief author, and we also have Senator Michelle Benson in the Senate, who's our chief author, and we have bipartisan support on this, which is not something that's normal right now, right? Everything is so polarized. But you'll see that we have Republicans and Democrats engaged in this work, and we're still working through, I think, the legislative process to get it on the ballot. And we plan to see it on the ballot next November in the next statewide election, so you all can vote on it and change the framework of public education in Minnesota.
Brother Anthony, I want to give you the same opportunity to let us know how we can support your work, but I also want to ask, because I know that you specifically work with youth, and I know from years of working with youth and just from being a father, that when you work with youth, sometimes you get these moments that are just spark moments that you realize, okay, we're moving in a good direction, and if we keep this up, we're going to get there. And I'm just wondering if, in your years of working with youth, if you have a spark moment like that sticks out for you.
First and foremost, of course, counterstories.com. You can go there and support that work. I also want to lift up the work of independent journalist Georgia Fort with Black Press. You can look her up, support her journalism. She, while in Duluth, is the one who broke the story of the police chief in Duluth, who was a descendant of the woman who made the accusations in the Duluth lynchings. And so, and she's doing amazing work all across, and she's doing, and it's getting, she's supporting, she's keeping folks at the table in a narrative in a national way at the time. So wonderful opportunity to support Georgia Fort and her work and keep that going. I love just being able to lift her up in her work. So the moment immediately that comes to mind. So we do a civil rights research experience. It's a 6-week ethnic studies course At one point, we had multiple strands. We had an indigenous strand, we had a Latinx strand, and we had an African-American strand. And the idea follows cross-comparative ethnic studies where, we have moments where it happens in affinity and then moments where it's cross-collaborative. And so in one of the cross-collaborative spaces, we took young folks. Okay, I have two. I'm going to pull two stories out of there since you asked. So it's your fault. The first one was in the indigenous strand, and they needed extra chaperones, and so in order to do that, I got to kind of just follow along with some powerful leaders from Indian Ed and Minneapolis who were doing some amazing stuff. But we went to Third Mesa in Arizona. And it was amazing because when we got off the plane and we get to Flagstaff and we meet Romalita, who was taking us around from the Hopi Res. So for all you who watch Star Wars, that Princess Leia's buns are culturally appropriated from the Hopi people. And so we get to Flagstaff and it begins to snow. And so Romalita pulls up and was like, oh, y'all the ones from Minnesota who brought the snow. And our theme was Miniwachoni, right? And so we were like, okay. And so we get to the high school on the res. And this is after having been on Third Mesa, and it's getting a little stormy, so you can like reach up and feel the electricity in the air. I mean, it was just beautiful. Home cooked meal. It was just awesome. So we get to the school, and the kids had made this artwork for the young folks who had come from, and most of the young folks were Anishinaabe and Dakota who, with us. And I was really nervous because we have two at the time of the only kids who were fluent in Dakota. And we had those two kids, and their dad teaches at the University of Minnesota. So I'm like really, really nervous. Like they get a sniffle and I'm like, okay, what, are we good? Drink this vitamin C drink, right? So they sit around the circle and they have this name that we're the kids from Minnesota who brought the snow, right? And in this area, particular area, moisture, especially at this time, is a big deal, right? So they open up this wonderful conversation, and some of the Anishinaabe kids in there were like, well, it's snowing now, so there's some things that we can talk about in terms of our stories that we couldn't because now there's snow on the ground. So there was this beautiful signs that I was not even aware of, right? And then the Hopi kids asked, why did you come? And they were like, well, we wanted to know about your experience and connect it to ours. And the tears that began to hit that group of young folks who were like, we never thought anybody would want to come and learn about us. And these kids just ended up forming these bonds and this amazing thing. And then they made this little light up cloud thing of cotton balls and lightened from stuff that this put together so that they had it in our bus so we could take the clouds with us. I kid you not. We get back here to the Bedote where a few folks here, Ethan Nerdaws and Mama Ramona Kito Stately, we're going to talk to our kiddos, and it was spring, right? So it was warmed up and there was no snow on the ground when we got back here. And so we get to the Bedote and it snowed. So if there wasn't and so it was powerful, right? And they had just gotten off of literally the week before the Latinx strand where our bus broke down in Utah. And because we had kids who were undocumented with our space, they recognized the area from their journey and were able to get us to a town. Like God is working in this space. The last story, the second one, the piece that sparks for me, right? And these are kids activating on this knowledge that this is what happens when we have the real conversation and the real truth. It was African-American strand. We get to DC and we get a call from Keith Ellison's folks who, somebody in his congressional office, because there was something happening in the National Mall and they knew they were going to be there and they wanted to pass along that there's something happening. And we had just gotten off the bus at the Lincoln Memorial. And it was just something in us because of the experiences that we had just traveling there where security was called on us at bus stops. They gave a guy with a janitor a walkie-talkie and made him security when we were in a space. And so we were already feeling that space. We get to the National Mall and we're looking around and we get this call and I said, okay, do you have any other details from it? They're like, yeah, there's some group with black shirts. And then we looked down and realized that we were wearing black shirts. We were the disturbance that somebody called in at the Lincoln Memorial. We go into the Lincoln Memorial and the kids are there. They're standing in the place where King gave the I Have a Dream speech. They're looking up and they're having a wonderful space. Meanwhile, there's a marching band practicing and rehearsing at the reflecting pool and a cheerleading squad in a little grassy area next to it. But yet people were coming up to us trying to shush our kids. And they're coming up to the white staff and the white chaperones around and telling them, what are they doing? They're causing disturbance. And can you, I wish somebody would tell them to be quiet, right? So our kids are doing what everybody else is. but yet people are coming in looking at them. And so our kids decided, okay, well, if they're going to treat us the same way anyway, and they get into a circle and they really have a demonstration. They have a die-in, they start marching chants and all of this, and they collect this crowd of people who are trying to shush them. And then these kids, and this is all while the adults are just trying to figure out what the hell are we going to do to keep everybody safe. They line up 2 by 2, and they start marching towards the Korean War Veterans Memorial. Meanwhile, these folks are still shushing them, trying to tell them about themselves, right? And we're just standing there going, what are these kids doing? But we got to back their play. Otherwise, we're liars, right? So we're watching, just trying to make sure everything is safe. And then they walk them by the Korean War Veterans Memorial. But now they're done chanting and singing and stuff like that. Now they're quiet. And they walk past, and now the people that are loud are the people that have been shushing them. And the veterans, because if it's the Korean War Veterans Memorial, there's always some veterans around just kind of holding the space, right? They begin to step up, and these white men standing there keeping guard form a line in front of our kiddos to be a barrier between them and the folks around them. And the kids have marched them there. And the thing that it says on there is freedom ain't free. So these kids had the wherewithal not only to read the situation, to come up with an idea or solution of what they wanted to do, to march these folks by that place on their way to the King Memorial. And the Korean War veterans who were there also picked up on what was happening around and protected and backed the play. And then walked with us and kept a little bit behind us as we got to the King Memorial to make sure none of these folks followed us. And then when we got there, one lone brother on horseback, a black police officer, rose up and he says, hey, I just want to check out. Somebody said there was a disturbance here. And the kid looks up to him and says, so they sent you? And the realization that he was sent by himself on horseback to deal with something on the National Mall. So the confluence of all of these things, and I use that word specifically, was a sparking moment that when you tell the truth to young folks and you help them to see the world as it is, not as it's safe for other folks or for dominant culture, they begin to activate and use that knowledge and that language to create their own environments. And if we back their play, beautiful things will happen. What would have happened if we backed the play of those at the lunch counters, backed the play of the interracial group of folks who filled up Parchman Prison so that nobody else could be there? These are the beautiful things that happen when we back kids' play. But now we're fighting just to be able to tell them the truth. Those are the spark moments for me.
All right, we want to offer an opportunity for any questions from the audience, both in-house and online. So I guess if you're in-house and you have a question, if you want to just rise and speak it out, and I'll repeat it for the through the microphone for the online folks. And then we do have a moderator here who is monitoring the Q&A. So if you're online watching us, you can ask any questions in the Q&A feature there. So Bill, looks like you have a question there.
We've got one. Ibram Kendi says we must change racist policies. As an individual, I feel powerless. Can you name some group initiatives I can join who are working on practical policy changes?
We'd love to have you engage with the Page Amendment. I mean, like, we definitely need more people engaged with the Page Amendment across the state. So you can reach out to me at nevada@ourchildrenmn.com. And I'm going to leave some flyers here, but I can also share information about how to engage with that campaign with Jim Bear to get that out to folks.
I would also add to that, as Christine mentioned last night, the Indian Child Welfare Act is currently under attack right now at the Supreme Court, and she did a great job of spelling it out. This is absolutely ridiculous. The law firm that is bringing the case against ICWA is also the law firm representing some of the biggest oil companies in the country, because if they can overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act, then all of Indian sovereignty is now up for grabs, which means the land is up for grabs. Incidentally, some of those law firms that are bringing the case not only represent oil companies, but also represent casinos and private individuals who want to build casinos and want Indian gaming undone. in certain states like Minnesota. So definitely follow along, as this case is arguably the most important case for Indian policy of this generation right now to follow. So follow along, and if it does get overturned, be prepared for a fight and be prepared to act. Any questions from the, yes?
I know that sounds like you're not doing anything, but trust me, wealthy people call their legislators all the time about what they want and what kind of policies. Those policies that you don't like when you see passed and you wonder where it came from, that is because someone else decided they wanted to get into the room before you got there. And so policy can be changed, especially on something like the legislation that Christine. If you want to be in solidarity, if you want to be an ally, get on the phone and call the people that you know, that say they represent you, the one that have to take your call, and call their. I just wanted to say that because I don't want anyone to think that they don't have power in this game, especially when you accept the narrative that it's going to happen, and these other people know something else too, and they make the calls that we don't.
Thank you, Pastor Dwayne. Any other questions in-house? No?
Over here.
Oh, Mr. Russell.
Thank you. I was struck, I think it was mentioned both nights, last night and today, that the first thing that has to happen in these promises for truth-telling and reparations is to stop the harm. And Governor Walz promised that there would be meaningful consultation with tribes, and then that got totally ignored on line 3. The Minneapolis City Council has made this promise of truth and reconciliation, yet on Friday, they rejected a neighborhood proposal in East Phillips to redevelop the roof depot into a community-based solution. They're going to pave it over, make it an expanded public works facility. Wondering if you've got any thoughts. I mean, shame does not seem to work. But any thoughts on how to, like, do a better job of calling out the hypocrisy?
There are two things. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, the question is thoughts on strategies, because shame does not seem to work in persuading public politicians, but thoughts on strategies on how to better go about and put public pressure on public officials. And Scott was citing how Governor Walz made promises around line 3 and has not followed through, and also with the City Council of Minneapolis as well.
There are two things that come immediately to mind, and this is one of those areas where we'll think about the usual levers that we've usually pull: money and political leverage space, and I'm not trying to diminish those at all. And you know, the worries, things around divestment. But Christine said something last night that that boggled my mind, and it made the strategy go up. In that whole list of boarding schools, we're looking for records, right? And some of that challenge is that our own denominations have records that we have access to that we're not going to. And so I know there are other strategies that are at work and at play here, but we have some investigatory power collectively to uncover some of the ties. We saw this happen with some of the connections, explicit connections that were being made to those who were investing in, for example, in Standing Rock, when we're in some of that work there. When we took students to Standing Rock, one of the things that happened is we got pulled aside and had to go through some education from folks who were there. And one of the things they were doing is helping us to tie and see the direct ties from companies like Wells Fargo that were having implications of right there. And so there was illuminating something that helped some folks to do some actionable space with. I have to think about, if we're thinking about leverage points to push legislation beyond money and beyond, the marshaling of people for votes and things like that to make that concern there. What about our investigatory power and prowess? If we all got access to pieces of information that can help make some of these ties in here, I think that's an important leverage point too. Look at what happened when Wells Fargo became implicated, and all of a sudden there's this cascade of performative divestments or performative statements of we're no longer going to support that particular thing, and you can talk about whatever altruism is there. But there is information that we have access to that we can share, we can get access to, right? If I'm sitting there and I have a whole lot of documents, I'm not asking anybody to do anything illegal. I'm not trying to get you in trouble, Jim Bear and Reverend Pam. I'm not trying to get you in trouble, but there are things that have happened when I have to worry about and think about what information, what ties I may have to decision makings, what pieces of my own investment and benefit exist if a certain deal goes down or a certain thing is there. And so I can worry about somebody who may highlight what my voting record, somebody who may highlight, things here. But if I also have somebody highlighting what I stand to gain from eliminating ICWA or any of these other things, and if we've got folks who, I walk into a space, there's an immediate suspicion about what should be shared or not with me. But I have white colleagues and peers who are at the table in certain places who have access to information that would be beneficial for this fight, and you have the power to be able to put some of those things onto the table. And so these are some of the things that I'm starting to hear folks kind of talk about, and if I have to worry about that, or that's another leverage point. And so that's one of the things I'm wondering about is the data that we sit on and have access to. And if you're at a table where there's data like that to be able to be shared, how can you use your power and access to that data to be able to make some of these clear connections that can also add to the leverage?
Yeah, I would just add that this work around systems change is incredibly hard, and it takes a lot of people and it takes a lot of resources in terms of getting something to change. I mean, we talk about the long arc, right? And I think talking about the data, I know with Paige we have research, which for a lot of times in our communities, American Indian communities or BIPOC communities, we might come forward with our stories, which is qualitative, right? Qualitative information that we were able to be really powerful in those stories. They'll come back at us and they'll say, oh, no, that's not enough. You need to have that research and that data, that quantitative data. And so it's you really have to understand when you go into something where you want to be serious about it, you need to make sure that you have all of the pieces, that you have qualitative, you have quantitative, you have your community and your people, your organizations with you. You have people on the grass tops and the grassroots, right? Are there business leaders that care about this issue? And why should they care about it? Roof Depot, why would business leaders care about that project? And what does that mean for that community to have that versus a public utilities type of place, right? And I think that it's a lot of work. I mean, I just want to say it frankly, to do systems change work, it takes a lot of people and it takes a lot of things. And so kind of back to the other question about how do you engage in policy and change, there are so many ways to do that. It's just finding something you care about and getting connected to people who are working on the issue that you care about. And where do you fit? Because there's room for everybody to be a part of this kind of work.
I've been thinking about, just as we've been having this conversation, I've been thinking about, to talk a little bit about critical race theory, thinking about Derek Bell's concept of interest convergence. And that it's only when the interests of the elite, when they coincide with the interests of those who are marginalized, that change actually happens. And I'm conflicted because I think, and what he's saying is that we really need to do change because it's the moral, ethical, right thing to do. Because people are hurting, because people are dying, because people are disenfranchised. Like, that's why we need to do this. And it's not because we're wanting to continue to, again, appease whiteness and appease the elites. And so I know it feels naive, but again, it hurts. Like, everything that my colleagues here are saying is absolutely true. And at the same time, it hurts that we have to prove our worth. We have to do all these things in order to get a move, in order to get a shift. And so I'm just sitting in that. It's like, how many more times do we need to do the dance? How many more times do we need to do the data? How many more times do we need to show how this and why this benefits you in order to get the change? And I also know that that's how the change happens. But then at the same time, once the priorities shift, that change can also shift. And I think that's why we're dealing with this thing around the Voting Rights Act right now. Is because in 1965, there was a response to something, and that's why it was passed, right? I might be getting my years wrong, so forgive me if I am. And that's why it was passed. The interests of the elite, of the powerful politicians have changed right now so that it is no longer expedient for people of color to have the right to vote. And that's not enough for me. Yeah.
All right. Bill, can we use that mic as a house mic? Can you facilitate that? We have time for a couple of questions. Here.
Ooh, you just gave me a sermon. Ooh.
Go ahead, preach.
One topic that's been touched on in this conference, but it's throughout our city of Minneapolis as well, in St. Paul, is public safety. And I'm wondering how that transformation can happen so that there's justice.
Which one of you wants to fix that problem?
I mean, I'll just start and then I know you will expand upon this, but I think that one thing that we do a lot, we've done, and we've been sort of trained, like we've been programmed to do this, is to talk about things in a vacuum, like public safety stands out there by itself, and that there are no intersections with public safety and housing issues, education issues, health, public health issues. That, tribal nations are not connected into the community of Minnesota. Like, the siloing of issues is a huge problem for us. And I think we have, in the last, I don't know, like maybe 5 years, 10 years or so, like, started to get more comfortable with using the term intersectionality and understanding intersectionality of identity. So I'm not just a Indigenous person. I'm an Anishinaabe person. I'm not just I'm also a woman, I'm also a mom, I'm from rural Minnesota. Like, to understand the complexity of my identity and the intersectionality and where I live, right? And how I live and how I experience the world. But the same thing can be said about the issues that we have in community related to public safety, is that those issues are also intersectional, and that they touch into each other. So how do we actually start talking about this in a broader way than just saying that it's a policing issue, but it's actually, and I think this is where things are going, right, around defund the police, is how do you start talking about the broader community issues that play into public safety? And when we talk about Page Amendment, we absolutely know public education has implications to public safety. And we know that there is a school to prison pipeline in the state, and that, what does that, how do we actually start being more sophisticated, smarter, and getting out of those frameworks that we've been sort of, again, programmed to talk in, that we're all siloed away from each other. And I mean, I'm hearing that heart, Ebony, about what you're talking about, and that frustration. And I think that is exactly why we're here today, to talk about Black and Indigenous solidarity, is to get to that place where we are working together better, right, and stronger, and we're doing things in a way that's more collective and with power.
Can I say something about the word public safety?
Come on. All right.
for me, it feels like it's code for, it's a racial code term, a racial code word to talk about Black and brown people and to point the problem of racism back at us. That if you just solve for black on black crime, which is not a thing, if you just solve for that, if y'all just stop killing each other, if you just stop having premarital sex and having babies, if you stop doing all these things, then the problems that you're facing will go away. And Moynihan tried that in 1965 or 1967. I keep getting my 60s wrong, it's a blur. With the Moynihan report, after all these civil rights legislation was passed, he said the real problem is that there's too many single parents. The real problem is that the Black man isn't the man of the house. The real problem is all these things, right? And taking the onus off of white people to deal with their stuff. And so I want to reposition the question or reframe the question is how do white people stop harming Black and brown bodies? And that's not to say we don't got stuff to do, because we do. We got a lot of stuff to do as Black and brown people. But my question, because this is the context of the conference, is how do white bodies stop harming Black and brown bodies? Whether you be a police body, whether you're stopping someone from sitting at that lunch counter, whether you are following someone in a store because they don't look like they should belong there, or you're following someone and you're a Becky or a Karen and you're calling the police because Black kids are just being Black kids, having a good time, right? And so that is my question. And I think if we could, that's the real problem with public safety, is that there are too many white people who are willing, like you think about Trayvon Martin, you think about Ahmaud Arbery, you think about all of these people who have died just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and they were Black and brown. If we can solve for that, I think that's the real public safety issue. There are too many, and I'm gonna just be frank, there's too many unhinged white people who are playing with Black and brown lives, and it needs to stop.
Yep.
All right, we have time for one more question.
I wish I had framed it properly as a question, but I was talking with my sister Jewel Aircorn, who is here as a trauma specialist today, and over the last 10 years, Jewel has been teaching me about parallel trauma. Of course, there's all this historical trauma for people of every population, of all humanity, but the settlers who came and took and harmed, their white bodies are harmed. Their white souls are harmed. Our white souls are harmed. And the work of recognizing that hurt people, and recognizing the humanity, not the supremacy, but the humanity of being European descendants, means we have to deal with our own failures. We have to deal with our own frailties. We have to deal with the secrets of our history. I'm sorry, I just started preaching. Thank you for your sharing with us. We have so much work to do.
Panelists, to take maybe a minute, looking at you, Brother Galloway, soon to be preacher.
That's fair.
Any kind of last thoughts, last words?
I was in a Black theology class with Demian Wheeler at United Theological Seminary, and he had a guest, Dee McIntosh, come in and talk to us from Bethel University, and she brought this idea, I have to talk fast, of ontological shame. This idea that when the brain hits shame, you can do two things, right? Or you can do multiple things, but some of the big things you can do is either do the hard work of dealing with that shame, or I can create a reality in which that shame is never even felt. I can create a whole completely different reality. This is how folks get to 25 years old and then something triggers the memory of their abuse as a child because the predator played on their shame to create a whole new narrative in the brain. And I would offer that the finally telling the truth space is asking us to do the former rather than the latter. Because one of the things that supremacy, white body terrorism has to do is to create a whole new reality where I don't have to feel the weight of that very thing that happened right there, the thing that massacres black communities, indigenous communities over and over again. And so the invitation that I want to give is for us to lean into the harder part and not continue to create realities in which I can use code words, I can use, different framings, I can use different talking points so that I don't have to deal with the actual shame that's happening right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to sort of, in the final minute, reflect on what was stated. I think that just as much as we have the space for BIPOC folks to get together, and we need that, I think that white folks need to get together and start taking care of the stuff that you've created, and that it is not the responsibility for me or others in our communities to be responsible for the problems that you all have created and the systems that you've set up and the way that you have perpetuated that. And I think one way, look, at 7 Teachings, what we're doing is we're actually doing a pilot project where Brett and I are working with a group of leaders, white leaders, who are committed to racial equity and justice in the farming world, right? We've been working a lot with farmers. And so they're gonna be working with a cohort of white farmers in Minnesota and across the region to start talking about what does land mean here? What is the connection to indigenous people and tribal nations? What does it mean to see black farmers and other farmers of color stepping up and wanting to be in this space? And how, as white folks, are you dealing with your own issues related to, the privilege that you've had around being a farmer and talking through that? And so it's a pilot, and we expect that there's going to be mistakes made, and we're working as consultants with this group to help facilitate them to be the trainers, to get out into community and to have these broader conversations, because honestly, that it is exhausting for us. I mean, there are days where it's just exhausting to step the first foot towards my computer because so much is happening. And then we're also expected to take care of white supremacy on top of that. And it's just, that's not right. So I think that to find ways for you to be actively working towards that.
So you said similar to what I wanted to say, and so did Brother Anthony. So I will just say and offer a resource. Resma Menakem, he's an amazingly brilliant trauma Black man, just all of the different, adjectives and adverbs or whatever. He's amazing. And also from Milwaukee, which is where I'm from. So, there's that too. He has a book called My Grandmother's Hands. And it's a book for Black folks and white folks and police officers. My offering to white bodies is to get that book, gather some folks around you, and begin to work that book and to work those practices, and keep doing it. And one of the things that Resma says is that if white people did that work, it's going to take 9 generations to undo white body supremacy. 9 generations. So this is not a marathon. I mean, this is not a sprint. It's not a sprint. It is a marathon, a very, very, very long marathon. But that is going to take 9 generations to undo what has happened. I mean, to follow up on the comment that you talked about, to undo what has happened on our bodies collectively. And so that work has got to start today. And it's work that you're doing in concert with other white people. It's not work that you're asking Black and brown people to do for you in a relationship with. This is something you got to do by yourselves in community with y'all, because y'all know what has happened. And y'all know the racial code words, everything that has taken place. Not just in the United States. One of the things that Resma talks about is that this stuff happened in Europe before Black people even entered the picture. People were cutting off people's heads. People were doing some strange things, during the Middle Ages. And that trauma just keeps getting passed on and passed on. And so what happened to Black bodies and brown bodies in the 1700s and the 1800s were perfected hundreds of years ago in Europe, white on white body. So if we're gonna talk about Black on Black crime, we gotta talk about white on white crime, because that predated. So Okay, I'm done. My minute is over. I'm sorry, Tanda. But get Resma's book, work those practices, be in your body, be in community with other people, and then commit to it for the next 9 generations.
Thank you so much for your words, your perspectives, and your wisdom. Would you all join me in expressing gratitude to our panelists?
Miigwech. Thank you.